My name is Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward, smirking. You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in, disabled every family credit account, and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house, with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue, at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight as joined honor societies and funded my own software engineering degree just to earn a fraction of the respect my parents freely handed to my older brother Terrence. It never worked. The real wake-up call, the betrayal that forced me to finally cut the cord, happened exactly 6 weeks ago. I was standing in the center of the grand ballroom at the St. Regis Hotel, wearing a custom silk gown that I paid for myself. The massive crystal chandeliers above us cast a warm golden glow over 50 completely empty mahogany chairs that were perfectly arranged around tables adorned with white orchids. The venue was flawless, but the emptiness made it feel like a beautiful tomb. I had spent $15,000 to reserve this space to celebrate my engagement to my fiancé David. We had selected a menu of filet mignon and pan-seared sea bass that was currently sitting in the kitchen growing cold. On the right side of the room, David's family was fully present. His parents, his siblings, and his extended relatives were seated quietly at their designated tables, holding their crystal champagne glasses and trying desperately not to stare at the vacant chairs opposite them. But I could feel their eyes on me. I could feel the silent whispers passing between his aunts. Their expressions were full of quiet, uncomfortable pity. They were looking at my side of the room, which was nothing but a humiliating ghost town. Not a single person from my bloodline had bothered to show up. The jazz trio I hired was playing softly in the corner, trying to fill the devastating silence. The waiters stood by the walls, unsure if they should start pouring the expensive wine I had selected. I stood there feeling the weight of my diamond ring and the crushing reality of my existence in this family. I had paid their bills, I had funded their lifestyles. Yet on the most important night of my life, they could not even give me 2 hours of their time. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp buzz of my phone in my clutch. I pulled it out. It was an Instagram Live notification from my sister-in-law, Keisha. The screen lit up with the words, "Keisha is live now." I tapped the notification and the sound of loud hip-hop music instantly blasted through my phone speaker. David stepped closer to me, his brow furrowed in concern as we both stared at the screen. There was Keisha wearing a gaudy sequined designer dress that I knew for a fact she bought using the emergency credit card I gave my mother for medical expenses. She was standing in the grand foyer of a massive modern mansion, holding a red plastic cup filled with liquor and yelling into the camera lens with obnoxious energy. "Welcome to Terrence's new estate, y'all!" she screamed, spinning the camera around to show off a sweeping double staircase and a massive crystal chandelier that looked entirely out of place. "We are celebrating generational wealth tonight." My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot as the camera panned across the room. There was my entire family. My aunties, who claimed they were too sick to travel and needed me to pay their medical bills, were dancing in the living room without a care in the world. My cousins, who said they had to work, were eating plates of catered barbecue. And there in the center of it all was my mother Elaine and my father Richard raising their glasses to toast my brother. Terrence the Golden Son stood there wearing a silk button-down shirt, acting like a real estate mogul. This was a man who had not held a steady job since 2019. A man whose car insurance I had been secretly paying for the last 3 years, so his vehicle would not get repossessed. They had all skipped my engagement dinner to attend a housewarming party for a house Terrence had absolutely no business buying. I did not cry. Crying was a luxury I could no longer afford. As a software developer, my brain is trained to look for bugs in a system. I identify the broken code. I isolate the corrupted files, and I eliminate them from the system so the program can run smoothly. Looking at that video, I realized my family was the broken code. They were a virus that was designed to drain my resources while giving me absolutely nothing in return. Before I could even close the Instagram application, my phone began to vibrate with an incoming call. The caller ID flashed with my father Richard's name. I took a deep breath, swiped the screen to answer, and pressed the phone to my ear. I expected some kind of fake excuse, a lie about a flat tire or a medical emergency. I was prepared for the gaslighting, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer audacity of what came out of his mouth. "Hey, Charmaine," my father said loudly over the background music of the party. "Listen, I know you are busy with your little dinner thing right now, but Terrence is in a bit of a bind and we need your help immediately. No hello, no congratulations on your engagement, no apology for leaving me standing in an empty $15,000 ballroom, just an immediate demand." I stared at the empty chairs and kept my voice dangerously calm. "A bind, Dad. What kind of bind?" "Well, Terrence is closing on this magnificent property," my father explained, his tone dripping with pride for his son. "But there was a miscalculation with the closing costs and the escrow account. The lender needs an emergency wire transfer by tomorrow morning to finalize the deed. Tell David to wire $40,000 to your brother's account tonight. Consider it his welcome to the family fee. After all, David is a successful architect and he should be proud to invest in his new brother's future. Family helps family, Charmaine." I stood there in the echoing ballroom, letting his selfish words sink deep into my chest. The sheer audacity of his request paralyzed me for a fraction of a second before the anger finally took over. My father was not calling to check on me. He was calling to extort my fiancé. He expected David, the man whose family was currently watching me be humiliated, to pay a $40,000 ransom to a family that did not even respect me enough to show up and eat a free steak. The entitlement was so massive, it was almost suffocating. This is what the black tax looked like in my family. I was not a daughter, I was an ATM machine. And now they were trying to plug David into their network of financial abuse. I let out a low, cold laugh. The sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers. David placed a supportive hand on the small of my back, his jaw clenched in quiet anger. "You want David to pay an entrance fee?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You want my fiancé to wire $40,000 to a family that could not even bother to show up to eat the $150 a plate dinner I bought for you?" My father immediately shifted into his defensive, gaslighting tone. "Oh, do not start acting all sensitive and dramatic, Charmaine," he snapped. "An engagement is just a party. You two are already living together anyway. This is real estate. Your brother is building actual generational wealth here. You have always been so selfish with your money. Terrence is the man of the house and he is trying to establish his legacy. You need to stop being jealous and support your own blood." "Generational wealth," I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of the words. "Terrence does not even have the credit score to finance a washing machine, let alone a 6-bedroom mansion." "But sure, Dad. Let us talk about generational wealth. Let us talk about how you think my money and David's money belongs to Terrence." I did not give him a chance to respond. I simply took the phone away from my ear and tapped the red end call button. I stood in silence for a moment, listening to the jazz music. The humiliation I had felt just 10 minutes ago was completely gone. In its place was a cold, calculating clarity. I had spent my entire life trying to buy my way into their hearts. I thought if I was smart enough, successful enough, and generous enough, they would finally see me as equal to Terrence. But my father had just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle. They did not just want my money, they felt entitled to it, and now they wanted David's money too. I turned to David. He was watching me with those calm, intelligent eyes. He did not pity me. He respected me, and he was waiting for my command. Tell the venue to pack the food into to-go boxes and donate it to the shelter downtown. I told him, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. And then tell your family we are leaving. David nodded, pulling his car keys from his tailored suit pocket. Where are we going? He asked, his voice low and protective. He already knew I was not the kind of woman to go home and cry into my pillow. I wiped a single stray tear from my cheek and lifted my chin. My father said my brother is building generational wealth, I replied, grabbing my clutch from the table. I think it is time we go see this generational wealth for ourselves. Let us go crash a housewarming party. We walked out of the St. Regis Hotel, leaving the empty ballroom and the ghost of my childhood desperation behind us. As we stepped into the cool night air and got into David's car, my software developer brain started running algorithms. Terrence had no income. My parents had moderate retirement savings. So where did the money for a luxury mansion come from? Someone was lying. Someone was hiding a massive financial secret, and I was going to tear the entire architecture of their lie down to its foundations. Tonight, I was not just going to confront them, I was going to audit my entire family. I pulled my work laptop from the trunk of the car as David started the engine of his Audi. The glowing screen illuminated my face in the dark cabin of the vehicle as I logged into public property tax databases. By the time we arrived at that mansion, I would know exactly who signed the deed, who authorized the loan, and whose financial grave was being dug. The era of the dutiful daughter was officially over. It was time to show them what happens when you try to extort the woman who holds all the keys. The drive to Terrence's new neighborhood took exactly 22 minutes, but sitting in the passenger seat of David's car, it felt like an entire lifetime. I kept my eyes locked on the glowing screen of my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard as I accessed the county property tax records. By the time David pulled onto the sprawling circular driveway of the property, my heart was pounding a steady rhythm of pure, unfiltered rage against my ribs. The house was massive. It was a looming, modern monstrosity of glass and cheap stone veneer, sitting on a plot of land that looked entirely out of place in this zip code. Cars were parked haphazardly across the freshly laid sod of the front lawn. Luxury vehicles mixed with beat-up sedans belonging to my extended family members who had all prioritized this fake display of wealth over my actual engagement. Bass-heavy hip-hop music thumped against the windows of our car, vibrating through the floorboards. David shifted the vehicle into park and turned off the engine. He did not say a word. He simply unbuckled his seatbelt, stepped out of the car, and walked around to open my door. We walked up the wide concrete steps together. I was still wearing my custom silk engagement gown, the hem dragging slightly against the pavement, while David looked impeccable in his tailored charcoal suit. We looked like we belonged on the cover of a bridal magazine, but we were about to walk into a war zone. I did not bother knocking. I pressed my thumb hard against the glowing Ring doorbell. A few seconds later, the heavy double doors swung open. Keisha stood there holding a plastic cup of brown liquor. She was practically dripping in tacky designer logos. She wore a bright red Gucci dress that was 2 sizes too small, paired with chunky Chanel earrings that looked like they had been purchased out of the trunk of a car. A smug, satisfied smirk spread across her face the moment she saw us standing on the porch. "Oh, wow," she drawled, her voice slurring slightly. "You guys left your little party early to come celebrate the real boss of the family. I guess nobody wanted to eat that dry hotel food, huh?" I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply stepped forward and used my shoulder to physically push past her into the grand foyer. "Excuse me," I said coldly, my voice cutting through the heavy scent of cheap perfume and fried food that hung in the air. Keisha stumbled backwards, splashing a little bit of her drink onto the pristine white tile floor. "Hey! Watch the dress," she shrieked, but I was already moving. I walked straight into the center of the massive living room. There were at least 60 people packed into the space. My aunts, uncles, cousins, and several people I did not even recognize were gathered around a massive kitchen island, eating and laughing. The moment they saw me standing there in my white silk gown, the laughter died. It was immediate. Someone scrambled to grab the remote, and the loud music was abruptly completely cut off. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. Every single pair of eyes turned to look at me. I saw my Aunt Sarah lower her paper plate. I saw my Uncle Marcus look down at his shoes, unable to make eye contact. The sheer, overwhelming guilt radiating from my bloodline was palpable. They knew exactly what they had done. They knew they had abandoned the woman who had paid for their medical bills, their car repairs, and their groceries just to come drink free liquor at the house of a man who contributed absolutely nothing to society. Before anyone could say a word, my mother Elaine pushed her way through the crowd. She was wearing a brand new floral dress that I knew I had unknowingly paid for through her monthly allowance. I expected her to look embarrassed. I expected her to offer some pathetic excuse for missing the most important night of my life. Instead, her face was twisted into a scowl of deep disapproval. "Charmaine, what on earth are you doing?" she hissed, grabbing my arm and trying to pull me toward the hallway away from the crowd. "Are you out of your mind coming here dressed like that and making a scene in front of Keisha's family?" I yanked my arm out of her grip with so much force she stumbled. "Making a scene?" I repeated, my voice dangerously calm, but loud enough for every single person in that room to hear. "You all abandoned my engagement dinner, a dinner I paid $15,000 for. You left me standing in an empty room with 50 vacant chairs so you could come here and worship Terrence. And you are worried about me making a scene." My mother crossed her arms defensively, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "You do not need to be so dramatic, Charmaine," she whispered harshly. "We had to be here tonight. Terrence is the man of the house now. He is stepping up and securing our legacy. You have David. You are fine. You should be proud of your brother instead of acting jealous." The words hit me like a physical blow. The man of the house. The sheer, unadulterated delusion of that statement completely shattered the last remaining ounce of respect I had for my mother. For years, I had silently carried the crushing weight of the black tax. I had sacrificed my own peace, my own savings, and my own youth to make sure my parents never had to struggle. And this was my reward. Being told I was jealous of a professional failure. I took a deep breath and let the truth rip through the silence of the room like a chainsaw. "Man of the house." I shouted, the volume of my voice startling several people in the front row. "Man of the house. Mom, I paid off the mortgage on your house 2 years ago so you and Dad could retire. I send you $1,200 every single month for groceries and utilities. I paid for Aunt Sarah's knee surgery and Uncle Marcus' truck repairs. What has Terrence bought you besides high blood pressure and empty promises?" The entire room collectively gasped. Aunt Sarah covered her mouth with her hand. The whispers erupted immediately. The facade of the perfect, wealthy family was cracking wide open right in front of their eyes. My mother turned a deep shade of crimson, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You have no right to discuss private family business in public," she stammered, her voice trembling with humiliation. Before I could deliver the final blow to her ego, the crowd parted again. Terrence made his grand entrance. He strutted down the sweeping double staircase wearing a ridiculous silk robe over his clothes, acting like he was a king surveying his loyal subjects. He held a glass of champagne and wore a look of pure, arrogant entitlement. He walked straight past me, completely ignoring my presence, and stopped directly in front of David. "Well, well, well," Terrence said, puffing out his chest. "Look who decided to finally show up and pay their respects to the new boss." "I am glad you came, David. Did Charmaine give you the message from Dad? I need that $40,000 check for the closing costs right now. We have some final paperwork to clear up tomorrow morning, and I'm not taking no for an answer." David did not reach into his pocket. He did not flinch. He just stood there looking at Terrence with the kind of calm, detached observation a scientist gives a mildly interesting insect. David is a highly successful commercial architect. He understands structure. He understands foundation. And most importantly, he understands when a building is nothing more than a cheap illusion. Terrence stepped closer, trying to use his height to physically intimidate David. "We are family now, Dave," Terrence sneered aggressively. "You want to marry my sister? You have to invest in the family. That is how this works. Hand over the check or you can turn around and walk right back out that door." The tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating. Keisha was smirking from the corner, completely confident that David would fold under the pressure and hand over the money. My parents watched with bated breath, hoping their golden son would successfully extort my fiancé. But David calmly looked away from Terrence's angry face and let his eyes wander up toward the ceiling. He scanned the crown molding and the archways. Then he looked back at Terrence, offering a chilling, emotionless smile. "You did not buy this house, Terrence. The load-bearing walls are cheap and the zoning is commercial. Who really owns this property?" The silence following David's question was absolute. Terrence's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes darted toward Keisha, whose face had suddenly drained of color. The arrogant king suddenly looked like a terrified boy caught stealing. But the vulnerability vanished instantly, replaced by explosive rage. Terrence lunged forward, closing the distance between himself and David. His face turned mottled red and the veins in his neck bulged. "What did you just say to me, you arrogant piece of trash?" He spat, his fists clenched. "You come into my house and disrespect me in front of my family. You think a nice suit lets you talk down to me." Before David could blink, my father stepped directly between them. He did not push Terrence back. Instead, he turned his anger entirely on me, pointing a shaking finger inches from my face. "Listen to me, Charmaine," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the cheap drywall. "You are a disgrace bringing this man into your brother's home to insult him tonight. Terrence is a homeowner and a provider. You are nothing but a bitter, jealous little girl who cannot stand seeing anyone else succeed." I looked at my father, whose retirement was currently being funded by direct deposits from my checking account. He was willing to defend a lie rather than acknowledge the obvious truth staring him right in the face. "If you do not write that check and apologize to your brother," my father continued, his voice trembling, "I am done with you. You are no longer my daughter. You will be dead to this family and have nothing." I did not flinch. I did not shed a tear. The threat of being disowned by people who only loved me for my bank account was not a punishment. It was a release. I looked my father dead in the eye and offered a smile that was completely devoid of warmth. "You cannot disown an ATM machine, Dad," I said softly, my voice slicing through the heavy tension in the room. "You can only unplug it, and as of tonight, your access is permanently denied." I turned my back on him. I did not look at my mother, who was now openly weeping into Aunt Sarah's shoulder. I did not look at Keisha, who was glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Let us go, David," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "We are done here." I linked my arm through his, and we walked out the front door, leaving the chaos of my bloodline behind us. The heavy double doors slammed shut behind us, cutting off the sound of my father's shouting. The cool night air hit my face, serving as a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the mansion. We walked down the wide concrete steps and across the crowded lawn in total silence. My silk engagement gown brushed against the damp grass, but I did not care about the dress anymore. My mind was already shifting gears. The emotional daughter who had spent 35 years craving her parents' approval was officially dead. In her place, the software developer, the systems analyst, the woman who made a living identifying fatal flaws in complex digital architectures, woke up. My brain went into overdrive, processing the data points I had just collected. Data point 1 was Terrence's reaction. He did not defend his purchase. He attacked David's character. That was a classic deflection tactic used by someone hiding a massive vulnerability. Data point 2 was the architecture of the house itself. David was right. The layout was wrong. The materials were cheap. It looked like a commercial property that had been hastily retrofitted to look like a luxury residential home. Data point 3 was the $40,000 closing cost request. Legitimate real estate transactions do not require emergency overnight wire transfers from third parties to clear escrow. It was a shakedown. Someone was demanding cash, and Terrence was desperate enough to try and extort my fiancé to get it. David unlocked the Audi, and we both slid into the leather seats. He started the engine but did not immediately pull away from the curb. He gripped the steering wheel and turned to look at me in the dim light of the dashboard. "Are you okay, Charmaine?" he asked. his voice gentle but laced with underlying concern. He had just watched my entire family cast me out, and he was waiting for the inevitable emotional collapse. He expected me to break down. He expected me to cry over the loss of my parents. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, resting it firmly on my knees. I flipped the screen open, and the bright light illuminated the dark cabin of the car. "I do not get sad, David," I said, my fingers already flying across the keyboard, bypassing the standard search engines and logging directly into the encrypted county property tax database. "I get suspicious. Terrence has not held a steady job since 2019. He has a credit score that is lower than his shoe size. There is zero logical way a reputable bank approved him for a 6-bedroom mansion in this zip code. Someone is lying, and I am going to find the broken code in their story." David watched me type, his expression shifting from concern to deep admiration. "What exactly are we looking for?" he asked, leaning closer to look at my screen. "The truth," I replied, hitting the enter key to access the public registry of deeds. "I am running a comprehensive public records check on this exact address right now. I want to see the paper trail." The loading icon spun on the screen for a few agonizing seconds as the database queried the massive server. I could hear the faint thumping of the bass from the housewarming party still vibrating through the night air outside our car. They were back in there celebrating their victory, convinced they had successfully kicked me out of the family while protecting their golden son. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who could dismantle their entire reality with a few keystrokes. The database refreshed, and a dense spreadsheet of property records flooded my screen. I maximized the window and scrolled directly to the most recent transaction history for the property. I highlighted the line detailing the current ownership and stared at the text. A cold, sharp sense of vindication washed over me. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the glowing screen. David leaned in, his eyes scanning the digital document. "Terrence's name is not on the deed," he read aloud, his voice tight with realization. "Of course it is not," I replied, my tone clinical and detached. "The property is registered to an entity called Apex Holdings, LLC. It is an obscure shell company registered just 3 weeks ago. Terrence did not buy anything today. He is just a tenant. He is throwing a housewarming party for a property he is renting, probably at an absurdly inflated rate." But my analytical mind was not satisfied. An LLC ownership explained the fake homeowner facade, but it did not explain the desperate demand for $40,000. A standard rental deposit would not require an emergency overnight wire transfer. There had to be another layer to the scam. I opened a new tab and ran a cross-reference search using the LLC's corporate registry number. I needed to see all financial instruments tied to this specific entity within the last 30 days. I bypassed the firewall of the public registry using my corporate developer access, pulling up the secondary loan market data. The screen populated with a new list of documents. My eyes scanned the lines of code and legal jargon, moving rapidly down the list until they stopped dead on a freshly recorded financial instrument. My breath caught in my throat. The cold logic in my brain was suddenly hijacked by a sickening wave of pure horror. David noticed the sudden rigidity in my posture. "What is it, Charmaine?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. "What did you find?" I could not speak for a moment. I just stared at the screen as the magnitude of the betrayal settled into my bones. It was not just a rental agreement. It was a collateralized debt obligation. I clicked on the linked document, expanding the scanned PDF of the legally binding agreement. But worse, much worse than the LLC, was the origin of the funding. "Oh my God," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "They did not just lie about the house, David. What are you looking at?" he demanded, his eyes locked on my pale face. I slowly turned my laptop toward him, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "I see a newly recorded financial lien linked directly to the LLC," I explained, my voice barely above a whisper. "But the lien is not secured by this mansion. The collateral for this massive loan is tied directly to my parents' home address. It is the house I paid off." The rest of the weekend was a blur of cold calculation. I did not sleep, I did not cry. I spent Saturday and Sunday pacing the hardwood floors of my apartment, drinking black coffee and mapping out the financial web my family had tangled themselves in. By the time Monday morning arrived, I was no longer a betrayed daughter. I was a predator hunting for the fatal flaw in their system. I walked into the sleek glass lobby of my high-rise corporate office building in downtown Manhattan at exactly 7 in the morning. The city was just waking up, but my mind had been racing for 48 hours straight. As the vice president of risk management at a top-tier financial firm, I had access to databases that the average civilian did not even know existed. I took the express elevator to the 42nd floor, walked past the empty cubicles, and locked myself inside my corner office. I booted up my dual-monitor workstation, bypassing the standard internet protocols and logging directly into the encrypted Federal Financial Registry. My fingers struck the keyboard with a rhythmic intensity. I pulled up the parcel number for my parents' property, the 4-bedroom colonial house in Connecticut, the house I had systematically paid off over 5 grueling years, sacrificing my 20s to ensure they could retire without the crushing weight of a mortgage. When the file loaded, the numbers on the screen confirmed my darkest suspicions. My parents had not just co-signed a standard residential lease for Terrence, they had executed a massive extraction of equity. The document staring back at me was a home equity line of credit, a HELOC, but this was not a small loan to renovate a kitchen or fix a roof. It was an aggressive, predatory financial instrument for $500,000, $500,000, extracted directly from the walls of the home I had bled to secure for them. I analyzed the terms of the loan and felt a sudden wave of nausea wash over me. The interest rate was astronomical. The repayment terms were incredibly punishing, designed specifically to trigger a default. They had taken this $500,000 and handed it directly to Apex Holdings, LLC, acting as a shadow guarantor to fund Terrence's fake luxury lifestyle. They had literally mortgaged their own survival, their roof, their future, to buy their golden son a temporary illusion of success. The $40,000 Terrence had demanded from David was not for closing costs on a purchase. It was the initial balloon payment required by this predatory lender to keep the HELOC from going into immediate default. Terrence had drained the initial cash injection and was already drowning in the debt he could not service. My parents had handed him a loaded financial gun, and he had pointed it directly back at their heads. The level of financial illiteracy, combined with their blind worship of my brother, was a recipe for absolute ruin. They had legally signed away their security. I reached for my cell phone resting on the polished mahogany desk. My hand was completely steady. I found my mother's contact and pressed dial. The phone rang twice before she answered. Her voice was clipped and defensive, clearly still carrying the resentment from the housewarming party. "Charmaine," she said sharply, "if you are calling to apologize to your brother, you need to do it to his face. I do not want to hear your excuses over the phone." I bypassed any standard greeting. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the icy precision of a corporate auditor. "Did you leverage the house I bought you?" I asked. The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and heavy. The arrogant bluster vanished, sucked entirely out of the conversation. "What? What are you talking about?" she stammered, feigning ignorance. "Do not play stupid with me, Mom," I replied, leaning back in my leather ergonomic chair. "I am reviewing the county records now. You and Dad took out a $500,000 home equity line of credit against the Connecticut house, the house that was fully paid off. You leveraged your entire retirement to act as a shadow guarantor for an LLC. You handed Terrence $500,000 of my hard-earned money so he could rent a fake mansion to show off on Instagram." My mother let out a sharp, defensive breath. Her guilt instantly morphed into weaponized anger. "It is our house, Charmaine," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "We can do whatever we want with it. Your name is not on the deed. We are the parents and we make the decisions. Your brother needed a chance to establish himself, and you were being completely selfish with your salary. You sit up there in your fancy corporate tower with your rich fiancé and you refuse to lift a finger to help your own blood. We had to do something. Terrence is a businessman. He just needed capital. A businessman. I repeated, a harsh laugh escaping my lips. Mom, he is unemployed. He is a fraud. He has blown through your equity, and now he cannot even make the first balloon payment. That is why Dad was begging David for $40,000 on the night of my engagement. You people did not come to celebrate my future because you were too busy trying to steal my fiancé's money to cover up your massive financial mistake. How dare you speak to me like that? My mother shrieked. Family helps family. You will understand when you have children. Terrence is going to flip that property and pay us back double. You just lack faith. I stopped arguing. Arguing with delusion is a waste of bandwidth. You have 30 days, Mom, I said coldly. 30 days before that predatory loan defaults and the bank seizes your house. Do not call me when the eviction notice arrives. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto my desk. My parents were completely oblivious to the real danger they were in. I needed to know who was holding the note. I turned my attention back to the dual monitors. The company that issued the loan was registered under a vague corporate umbrella. It was listed as a secondary investment fund in New Jersey. But shell companies always leave a paper trail, if you know where to look. I opened a terminal window and accessed the state business registry using a backdoor portal. I typed in the federal tax identification number associated with the predatory lender. The system displayed the articles of incorporation. I started peeling back the layers of the corporate onion. The lending firm was wholly owned by another holding company. That holding company was managed by a designated registered agent. I clicked on the agent's profile to reveal the managing director's signature block. I expected a faceless corporate trust. Instead, the digital document populated with a digitized signature and a printed name that made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. Darnell Washington. I stared at the name, blinking as if the text might change. It did not change. Darnell Washington was Keisha's older brother. Keisha, my sister-in-law. The woman who had smirked at me from the foyer of that mansion was the architect of this entire scheme. My mind assembled the terrifying puzzle pieces. Keisha and Darnell had targeted my family. They had exploited my parents. Blind obsession with Terrence. Darnell had set up the shell company to purchase the property for pennies on the dollar. Keisha had then convinced Terrence that he was a genius real estate investor who just needed a massive injection of capital to secure the ultimate family estate. They fed his enormous ego, knowing he would run directly to my parents for the money, and my parents, desperate to elevate their son, had handed over the equity of their fully paid home straight into Darnell's pockets. Darnell did not just lease the house to Terrence. He was the predatory lender holding the $500,000 lien against my parents' property. It was a closed-loop scam. When Terrence inevitably defaulted on the impossible balloon payments, Darnell would legally foreclose on my parents' house. Keisha would divorce, Terrence leaving him with absolutely nothing, and her family would walk away with $500,000 in clean stolen equity. It was a masterful, calculated financial slaughter. They had found the exact vulnerability in my family, their toxic loyalty to the golden child, and weaponized it to strip them of their only asset. My father thought he was securing generational wealth. He was actually signing the deed over to Keisha's brother. Terrence was not the man of the house. He was a useful idiot in a massive wire fraud conspiracy I sat in. The silent corner office, completely paralyzed by the sheer evil of the betrayal. I forced myself to breathe. The cold air conditioning of the corporate office felt like ice against my skin, but my mind was burning with absolute clarity. I needed to map every single transaction to ensure there were no alternate explanations. I opened a digital whiteboard application on my second monitor and began dropping the corporate entities onto the screen, drawing red lines connecting the financial data points. First, I pulled the original deed for the mansion Terrence was currently occupying. Darnell had purchased that property through Apex Holdings LLC nearly 6 months ago at a severe discount. It was a distressed commercial property that had been hastily rezoned. Darnell had likely paid no more than $200,000 for the entire plot. Next, I pulled the lease agreement that was filed with the county to establish Terrence's residency. The monthly rent Darnell was charging his own brother-in-law was a staggering $12,000. Terrence had absolutely zero ability to meet that obligation. That is exactly where my parents and their $500,000 home equity line of credit entered the equation. Keisha must have convinced Terrence that he was signing a rent-to-own agreement. She inflated his ego, telling him he was a real estate mogul building a massive portfolio. Terrence, believing his own hype, then went to our parents crying about a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity. He told them he needed a massive cash injection to secure the property and finalize the closing costs. My parents, blinded by their desperate need to see their golden son succeed, bypassed all logic. They went to the exact shadow lending company Keisha recommended. And that company was secretly owned by Darnell. The trap was perfectly executed. Every single dollar of my parents' hard-earned equity was being systematically funneled directly into Darnell's pockets. The $40,000 my father had demanded from David on the night of my engagement was the final puzzle piece. It was not for closing costs. It was the first massive balloon payment required by Darnell's predatory lending company to prevent an immediate default on the home equity line of credit. Terrence had already burned through the initial cash withdrawal, trying to furnish that massive empty mansion and throw a lavish housewarming party to impress his friends. He was entirely broke, and the debt was structured to crush him immediately. The sheer malice of the operation was breathtaking. Keisha and Darnell were not just stealing money, they were executing a hostile takeover of my family's entire financial existence. My parents had effectively handed the deed of the house I bought for them directly to a con artist. I printed every single document: the LLC registration, the deed transfer, the predatory loan terms, the digital signatures, and the corporate linkages. I compiled everything into a thick red legal binder that sat heavily on my desk. This was no longer just a family dispute over a ruined engagement party. This was a federal crime. It was felony wire fraud and elder abuse orchestrated by my own sister-in-law. I packed the red binder into my leather briefcase, shut down my workstation, and walked out of my office. I did not bother telling my assistant where I was going. I took the elevator down to the lobby and stepped out into the bustling Manhattan streets. I hailed a yellow cab and gave the driver the address for David's architectural firm, located in the financial district. I needed to see him immediately. The cab ride took 15 minutes, but I spent the entire time staring out the window at the passing skyscrapers, feeling a strange mixture of absolute fury and cold vindication. They had called me jealous. My mother had accused me of being selfish. My father had threatened to completely disown me. And all the while they were happily walking into an elaborate financial slaughterhouse. The yellow cab pulled up to a sleek glass building on Wall Street. I paid the driver and hurried inside. David's architectural firm occupied the entire 34th floor. When the elevator doors opened, I strode past the reception desk. The receptionist recognized me immediately and did not even try to stop me as I walked straight down the hallway toward David's private office. I pushed the heavy oak door open. David was standing by a massive drafting table, reviewing a set of complex blueprints with two junior architects. He looked up, surprised to see me, but the moment he registered the dark, intense expression on my face, he immediately dismissed his colleagues. They rolled up their plans and quietly exited the room, closing the heavy door behind them. David walked over to me, his brow furrowed with deep concern. "Charmaine, what is wrong?" he asked, reaching out to gently take my hands. "You are completely pale. What did you find in the property records?" I did not answer right away. I walked over to his massive glass desk, unlatched my leather briefcase, and pulled out the thick red legal binder. I dropped it onto the glass surface with a heavy thud. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet, elegant office. "I found the broken code, David." I said, my voice steady but laced with a dark metallic edge. David stepped up to the desk and opened the red binder. He is an architect. He knows how to read complex structural documents and identify fatal flaws in a foundation. It only took him a few minutes of scanning the highlighted financial records, the LLC registrations, and the predatory loan terms to understand the massive scale of the disaster. His jaw tightened and a muscle in his cheek twitched as his eyes locked onto Darnell's signature at the bottom of the loan agreement. "This is a shell company," David said, his voice low and dangerous. "Terrence does not own anything. He is leasing the property from Keisha's brother. And your parents." He paused, looking up at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Your parents leveraged their fully paid house to guarantee this garbage." I crossed my arms over my chest, feeling a cold chill radiate through my bones. "They did not just steal my money, David," I explained, my voice echoing slightly in the large office. "They are systematically stripping my parents of their only asset. They used Terrence's massive ego to bait the trap. Keisha hyped him up, and Darnell provided the paperwork. My parents handed over $500,000 of equity, thinking they were building a family legacy. But the debt is designed to be completely unpayable. By Christmas, Darnell will foreclose on my parents' house. He will seize the property I paid for and liquidate it. Once the money is secured, Keisha will file for divorce. She will leave Terrence with absolutely nothing and take the mansion. They are going to destroy my entire family and walk away incredibly rich." David stared at the documents, his eyes narrowing with a sharp protective fury. "This is a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. We need to contact federal authorities immediately," David stated, firmly closing the thick red binder. "We can easily get an injunction to completely freeze all the stolen assets. We can report Darnell to the state financial regulator for predatory lending practices and fraud." I shook my head slowly, my mind already formulating a much more devastating counterattack. "No," I replied, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "If we call the police right now, Darnell will just quickly dissolve the LLC and hide the stolen money offshore. Keisha will loudly play the victim, and my parents will inevitably blame me for ruining Terrence's big investment. They will proudly say I deliberately sabotaged him just because I was incredibly jealous. I am definitely not going to let them control the public narrative, David. I am going to let them gather in one room. I am going to let them feel incredibly victorious. And then I am going to drop this entire binder right on their heads." David looked at me, a slow, admiring smile spreading across his handsome face. He absolutely understood exactly what I really needed to do. "What is the very next strategic move, then?" he asked, leaning heavily against the sharp edge of his large glass desk. Before I could answer, my cell phone suddenly began to vibrate violently inside my purse. It was not just a single call, it was a rapid, continuous burst of notifications. Ping, ping, ping. The sound was relentless, echoing frantically in the quiet office. I reached deep into my leather bag and quickly pulled out the vibrating phone. The screen was completely flooded with alerts from Facebook, Instagram, and text messages from numbers I had not spoken to in years. The volume of incoming data was overwhelming. I unlocked the screen and opened the first message. It was a direct link to a heavily edited video. My manipulative sister-in-law Keisha had struck first. I tapped the link with a steady thumb while David leaned over my shoulder to watch the screen. The video opened with a tight close-up of Keisha's face. Her makeup was artfully smudged to simulate fresh tears. She was sitting in the front seat of her luxury SUV holding the camera with a violently trembling hand. "Y'all, I do not even know how to process this right now." Keisha sobbed into the lens, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. "I just had to get on live because the devil is truly attacking my family today. My sister-in-law Charmaine just came to our housewarming party and completely lost her mind. She is marrying this rich architect and now she thinks she is too good for her own blood. She called us ghetto. She called us broke. And then she looked my poor in-laws dead in the eye and said she was going to use her corporate lawyers to make them homeless." David let out a sharp breath of pure disbelief. I did not react. I just kept watching. Keisha stared directly into the camera, her voice rising in a calculated pitch of absolute hysteria. "She is a bougie, whitewashed sellout, y'all. She hates her black family. She hates seeing her black brother succeed." Terrence is just trying to build generational wealth for our community, and Charmaine is trying to tear him down because she wants to be the only successful one. Please pray for my family, y'all. The video ended. It already had over 4,000 views and hundreds of comments. The comments were a vicious echo chamber of pure internet toxicity. People who had never met me were calling me a traitor, a sellout, and a disgrace to the community. Keisha had expertly weaponized the exact demographic vulnerabilities of our hometown. She played the role of the oppressed, struggling Black family fighting against the cruel, elitist corporate sister. It was a masterpiece of social media manipulation. Before I could even lock my screen, the text messages began pouring in like a toxic avalanche. The flying monkeys had been officially dispatched. These were the extended family members, the church gossips, and the community busybodies who fed on drama and operated entirely on blind loyalty rather than actual facts. My Aunt Sarah, the same woman whose knee surgery I had personally financed, texted me a massive block of angry text. I cannot believe you, Charmaine. You forgot exactly where you came from. Money has turned your heart completely cold. How dare you threaten your parents? My cousin Marcus sent a string of angry text alerts, followed by a voice note calling me a corporate slave who abandoned her roots. I swiped away the notifications, feeling a strange sense of absolute detachment. The black tax is not just about money. It is an intricate web of extreme emotional extortion. It demands your absolute loyalty even when the family dynamic is literally bleeding you dry. If you set a boundary, you are instantly labeled a traitor. I looked up at David, who was pacing across his office, running a hand through his hair in deep frustration. We need to release a statement, David said, pulling out his phone. We can easily post the deed. We can show them that Darnell actually owns the house and Keisha is lying. No, I said firmly, slipping my phone back into my leather bag. We do not argue with a mob, David. Facts do not matter to people who are actively looking for a reason to hate you. If we post the deed, they will just twist it and say we illegally hacked their private financial records. We let them dig their graves as deep as they possibly can. Let them put all their lies on the public record. My phone vibrated again. This time it was an incoming call. The caller ID displayed the name of Reverend Thomas, the head pastor of my parents' massive megachurch in Connecticut. This was the man who had gladly accepted my generous annual tithes for the last 6 years. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone, setting the device gently on David's glass desk. "Hello, Pastor," I said, my voice completely level. "Charmaine." The pastor began, his voice dripping with that heavy, performative disappointment reserved for Sunday morning sermons. "I am calling because my heart is incredibly heavy today. I just saw the disturbing video your sister-in-law posted online. Your parents are sitting right here in my office weeping. They are completely devastated by your cruel threats." I closed my eyes for a single second. My parents were sitting in his office. They were actively participating in the lie. They knew exactly what Keisha was doing, and they chose to play the victims to save face in front of their congregation. They would rather let the entire community destroy my reputation than admit their golden son was a complete financial fraud. "Have you forgotten the biblical commandment to honor your father and your mother, Charmaine?" The pastor continued, his voice rising in righteous indignation. "The Lord demands forgiveness. You need to humble yourself, child. You need to come down here, apologize to your brother, and ask God to cleanse your arrogant soul." I let him finish his little speech. I let the silence hang in the office for 3 full seconds before I finally responded. "Pastor," I said, leaning closer to the microphone, "unless your prayers come with a $500,000 wire transfer to cover the massive real estate fraud currently occurring in your congregation, I suggest you lose my number entirely." "Excuse me," the pastor gasped clearly, shocked that a member of his flock would dare speak to him with such blatant disrespect. "You heard me," I replied coldly. "You are currently comforting 2 people who just leveraged their entire fully paid home to act as shadow guarantors for a fake shell company. Terrence does not own that house. Keisha's brother owns it. And by Christmas, your 2 weeping parishioners are going to be permanently evicted by the bank. So unless your Sunday collection plate is pulling in $500,000 this month, I highly recommend you stop preaching to me and start finding my parents a cheap apartment. I reached forward and ended the call. David stared at me, a slow, deliberate nod of approval forming on his face. He understood that the time for playing nice was completely over. The smear campaign was in full effect, but it did not break me. It only solidified my absolute resolve to burn their entire fraudulent empire to the ground. I need to get back to my office, I told David, picking up my briefcase. I have some very specific dinner invitations to draft and a caterer to book. I am going to host a lovely Thanksgiving dinner, and I am going to invite every single person who just attacked me online. David smiled a dangerous, calculating smile. I will call my security team and have them on standby for the dinner, he said, walking me toward the heavy oak door. And I will make sure my legal team is fully briefed on the default clause of Darnell's loan. We are going to close this trap perfectly. I kissed him lightly on the cheek and left his firm. I walked back out onto the busy Manhattan streets feeling more powerful than I had ever felt in my entire life. The narrative was completely out of their control. They thought public shame would force me into submission. They thought the collective guilt of the community would make me write that $40,000 check just to make the noise stop. They fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. I took a short cab ride back to my corporate high-rise. I needed to finish printing the financial diagrams and secure the digital backups of all the loan documents. I walked through the massive revolving glass doors of my building and headed straight for the private executive elevators. The lobby was expansive, filled with polished marble floors and armed security guards stationed at the front reception desk. It was usually a quiet, highly professional environment. But today the quiet was shattered. I heard the shouting before I even reached the security turnstiles. It was a loud, aggressive male voice echoing violently off the high marble walls. I do not care about your damn protocols. You minimum wage, rent, a cop? The voice bellowed. I am her brother, and you are going to let me upstairs right now. I stopped dead in my tracks. I turned toward the visitor reception desk. There, standing aggressively over the older security guard, was Terrence. He was no longer wearing his ridiculous silk robe. He was wearing a tight athletic shirt and jeans, his face flushed with pure, unhinged rage. I adjusted my grip on my briefcase and walked directly toward my furious older brother. The vast expanse of the polished marble lobby suddenly felt like an arena. The high ceilings usually echoed with the quiet hum of billion-dollar corporate deals and the clicking of expensive leather shoes. Right now, the only sound was the unhinged, ragged breathing of a man who realized his entire fraudulent world was beginning to collapse. Terrence did not look like a triumphant real estate mogul anymore. The facade had completely vanished. He was sweating heavily, staining the underarms of his athletic shirt. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, darting frantically around the pristine corporate environment like a cornered animal. Two of our massive security guards, dressed in immaculate black suits, had already flanked him. One guard had his hand resting casually but firmly near his utility belt, ready to forcibly eject my brother from the premises. Wait, I said, projecting my voice clearly across the lobby. My tone was cold, authoritative, and completely devoid of any familial warmth. The security guards immediately paused, turning their attention to me. I know this man. I will handle it. Stand down, but stay close. The guards stepped back, creating a tight perimeter. Terrence sneered, his upper lip curling into a look of pure, unfiltered disgust. Look at you! He spat, his voice echoing loudly enough to draw the attention of several executives waiting near the elevator banks. You think you are so untouchable up in this glass tower, Charmaine. You think having a couple of rent-a-cops makes you better than your own blood. You are nothing without family. You hear me? You are nothing. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. As a vice president of risk management, I am trained to remain absolutely motionless when a volatile asset is actively imploding. You do not interrupt the collapse. You let it happen and you document every single variable. Terrence's anger was not born from righteous indignation. It was born from sheer absolute terror. Darnell's shadow loan was already crushing him and he was desperate for cash. Keep your voice down, Terence, I replied evenly, my face an emotionless mask. You are embarrassing yourself in front of my colleagues. I do not care about your colleagues, he roared, taking a sudden aggressive step forward. The security guards instantly tensed, but I held up a single manicured finger, silently ordering them to hold their ground. I want him to keep talking. I needed him to dig the hole so deep there would be absolutely no way for him to climb out. You are going to listen to me, Charmaine? Terence continued, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. Keisha is just getting started. You think that little video was bad? You have no idea what we are capable of. We have the entire church behind us. We have the whole community looking at you like the greedy corporate sellout you truly are. I tilted my head slightly, observing him, as if he were a defective piece of software. And what exactly is your ultimate goal here, Terence? Did you bypass building security and scream in my lobby just to give me a social media update? His chest heaved as he leaned in closer, dropping his voice into a vicious, threatening growl. I am going to ruin you, he hissed. I am going to call every local news station in this city. I am going to tell the press that you and your rich little architect fiancé are actively abusing Black elders. I will tell them you are using your corporate lawyers to systematically terrorize your own parents and throw them out onto the street. How do you think your fancy firm is going to react when your name is plastered all over the headlines connected to elder abuse? How do you think David's high-profile clients will feel about hiring a man who steals from poor Black senior citizens? I will burn both of your careers to the absolute ground, Charmaine. I will make sure neither of you can ever work in this city again. The threat hung heavy in the sterile air of the lobby. It was a vicious, calculated attempt at total character assassination. He was weaponizing the current social climate, leveraging the powerful optics of race and class to completely destroy our professional lives. He knew that corporate entities hated terrible public relations. He knew that an accusation of elder abuse, even a completely fabricated one, could trigger internal investigations and cost David millions of dollars in commercial architectural contracts. Terence was incredibly stupid when it came to reading financial documents, but he possessed a feral cunning when it came to emotional manipulation. My right hand slowly slid into the tailored pocket of my suit jacket. My fingers brushed against the smooth metallic surface of my smartphone. Without breaking eye contact, I subtly pressed the side button, activating the high-definition voice recorder app I had opened in the cab ride over. I felt the tiny haptic vibration confirming that the device was actively recording every single syllable spoken in that lobby. That is a very serious accusation, Terence, I said, keeping my voice perfectly modulated, ensuring my diction was crystal clear for the recording. You are threatening to orchestrate a massive public smear campaign against David and me based on entirely fabricated claims of elder abuse. You are threatening to intentionally sabotage our professional careers. It is only fabricated if you pay up. He shot back, a sickening smile spreading across his sweating face, the smirk of a man who truly believed he had successfully outsmarted the system. You owe me, Charmaine. You owe this family. You have been hoarding your wealth for years while I struggled. You think you can just walk away from your obligations. No. You are going to fix the closing costs on my house. You are going to make this right. And how exactly do I make this right? I asked, taking a deliberate half-step back to give him enough space to hang himself with his own words. $100,000, Terence demanded, his eyes flashing with desperate greed. You're going to wire $100,000 into my personal checking account by the end of the business day. If that money clears, Keisha takes down the videos. The church backs off. I tell the community it was all a big misunderstanding and everyone goes back to normal. Your little corporate reputation stays spotless. If the money does not clear, I am going straight to the press. I stood perfectly still. The sheer audacity of his demand was almost poetic. He had just escalated a family dispute into a textbook case of felony extortion. He was openly demanding hush money in front of two licensed security professionals in the lobby of a federally regulated financial institution. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the morning mapping out his fraudulent shell company. He had no idea that I already held the complete financial blueprint of his entire destruction. He just saw a sister he thought he could bully into submission. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds. I wanted the recording to capture the heavy weight of his demand. I wanted the pause to reflect my absolute lack of intimidation. "Let me make sure I understand the exact parameters of your offer," I finally said, my voice ringing with lethal precision. "Are you officially asking me for $100,000 to halt a targeted defamation campaign, Terrence? Say yes clearly for my records." Terrence let out a harsh, arrogant laugh, completely oblivious to the massive legal bear trap that had just snapped shut around his ankle. Yes, he barked loudly, leaning forward so his voice carried across the marble floor. "Yes, I am demanding $100,000. Consider it an asshole tax for disrespecting me in my own home. Pay the money, Charmaine, or watch your entire life burn." "Got it," I whispered softly. My hand slipped out of my pocket, leaving the phone safely secured inside, still recording every breath. The anger, the frustration, the years of enduring the suffocating black tax, all of it completely evaporated from my body. I did not feel like a victim anymore. I felt like an executioner. I popped the brass latches of my leather briefcase. Terrence's eyes dropped to the bag, a greedy gleam appearing in his pupils. He probably thought I was going to pull out a checkbook right then and there. He thought he had won. Instead, I reached into the side pocket of the briefcase and pulled out a single, beautifully embossed envelope made of heavy ivory cardstock. It was sealed with dark red wax. I held it out toward him between my index and middle finger. Terrence frowned, staring at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "What the hell is this?" he asked, refusing to take it. "This is your invitation," I replied, my voice dripping with icy condescension. "I am hosting a late Thanksgiving dinner at David's penthouse this coming Thursday. I am inviting you, Keisha Mom, Dad, Aunt Sarah, and Reverend Thomas. Every single person who had something to say about me on the internet today is receiving one of these." Terrence crossed his arms, his face twisting in deep confusion. "You think I want to come eat turkey with you?" he scoffed. "I want my money." "Oh, you definitely want to attend this dinner, Terrence," I said, stepping forward and aggressively shoving the stiff envelope directly against his chest, forcing him to grab it so it would not fall. "Because Thursday night is when I am going to lay all my cards on the table. Bring your wife. Bring your fake generational wealth. Bring your entire fraudulent reality. If you want my money, you are going to have to come look me in the eye and earn it in front of an audience." I turned my back on him, completely dismissing his presence. I looked at the lead security guard who was watching the exchange with professional detachment. "Escort this gentleman off the property," I instructed, my voice echoing one final time. "If he ever attempts to enter this building again, you have my full authorization to arrest him for criminal trespassing and attempted extortion." Terrence opened his mouth to shout another threat, but the two massive guards immediately stepped forward, grabbing him firmly by both arms. "Hey, get off me!" he yelled, struggling uselessly against their iron grips. "Thursday night. Charmaine, you better have that money." I did not look back. I walked smoothly toward the private executive elevators, my posture perfect, my mind completely clear. The heavy steel doors slid open and I stepped inside, pressing the button for the 42nd floor. Through the closing gap of the doors, I caught one last glimpse of my brother being forcibly dragged backward through the revolving glass exits, clutching his beautifully embossed Thanksgiving invitation. I smiled sharply as the elevator began to rise. I had the financial documents. I had the audio recording. I had the venue secured. The flying monkeys were about to walk directly into the slaughterhouse. "See you on Thanksgiving," I whispered to the empty elevator car. The next 72 hours were a masterclass in calculated precision. I did not return any of the frantic phone calls from my parents. I ignored the venomous text messages from my extended family. I deleted the passive-aggressive voicemails left by the church congregation. I simply let the silence stretch out, allowing their collective arrogance to build into an absolute certainty that they had successfully broken my spirit. Instead of wasting my time arguing with a digital mob, I focused my energy entirely on the flawless execution of my trap. I hired a private courier service to hand-deliver thick ivory envelopes to every single person who had actively participated in the smear campaign against me. The invitations were elegant, printed in heavy gold foil, requesting their formal presence at a private Thanksgiving dinner at David's luxury penthouse in Manhattan. They were deliberately designed to look exactly like a formal surrender. I knew exactly how their toxic minds worked. In their twisted reality, my silence combined with a luxurious dinner invitation could only mean one specific thing. They fully believed I was preparing to hand over the $100,000 extortion check to make the public shame disappear entirely. They thought they had successfully weaponized the black tax and bullied the corporate sellout into absolute submission. David was incredibly instrumental during this vital preparation phase. He secured his private security detail, stationing two large men in dark suits discreetly near the service elevator of his building to prevent any unwanted physical altercations. He also coordinated extensively with his internal legal team, ensuring the secondary debt acquisition was completely locked in and legally binding. Darnell was going to walk into our home believing he was a predatory mastermind, without realizing he was already the prey. The trap was perfectly set, and the bait was undeniably irresistible. Thanksgiving evening arrived, wrapping the city in a cold, crisp autumn wind, while David's penthouse glowed with warm, ambient light. The apartment was a sprawling masterpiece of modern architecture, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the sparkling Manhattan skyline. A massive custom-built mahogany dining table sat in the center of the expansive room, set flawlessly for 22 guests, with fine crystal sparkling silver and immaculate white linen napkins. The rich, comforting smell of roasted turkey, buttery mashed potatoes, and seasoned herbs filled the air, courtesy of the private chef we had hired specifically for the night. At exactly 6 tonight, the private elevator doors chimed softly, and my family began to spill out into the grand foyer. They arrived in a massive unified pack, emboldened by their perceived victory over me. They were wearing their absolute Sunday best, displaying a level of pride that was entirely unearned. My Aunt Sarah hobbled in on her bad knee, wearing a ridiculously oversized church hat and a smug expression. Reverend Thomas arrived wearing a sharp three-piece suit, carrying his heavy leather-bound Bible, as if he were ready to deliver a grand sermon on forgiveness and financial generosity. My father Richard and my mother Elaine walked in with their heads held extremely high, their faces set in expressions of righteous vindication. Terrence stepped off the elevator, looking incredibly triumphant and arrogant. He wore a brand-new designer sports coat that he undoubtedly bought using whatever remaining credit he had left to his name. He looked around the luxurious penthouse with greedy, calculating eyes, mentally counting how much money he was about to extort from us before the dessert was even served. They were completely blinded by their own greed and entitlement. They mingled in the living room, drinking our expensive champagne and laughing loudly, completely comfortable in the space they believed they had conquered. But the absolute pinnacle of their collective audacity was Keisha. She strutted into the penthouse wearing a tight emerald green dress, a sickeningly sweet, victorious smile plastered across her face. And walking right behind her, casually observing the expensive artwork hanging on David's walls, was Darnell. She had actually brought the architect of the entire financial scam directly into my home. Darnell wore a custom-tailored suit and offered me a smooth, arrogant nod, clearly believing he was entirely untouchable. They were parading the wolf right into the sheep pen, completely unaware that the pen was actually a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. I stood near the sleek marble kitchen island, holding a delicate glass of sparkling water, projecting an aura of total defeat. I kept my eyes slightly downcast, playing the exact role they expected to see. The broken, exhausted daughter. The humbled, defeated sister. My mother, Elaine, immediately separated from the laughing pack and walked directly toward me. She did not offer a hug or a warm holiday greeting. She simply stood next to me, sipping from a crystal flute of champagne and looking out at the dazzling city skyline. "I am genuinely glad you finally humbled yourself, Charmaine," my mother whispered, her tone dripping with toxic condescension. "It takes a lot of maturity to admit when you are completely wrong. A strong black woman keeps the family together no matter what the cost. You are doing the right thing tonight by paying your brother the respect and the capital he rightfully deserves. I turned my head slowly to look at the woman who had happily mortgaged her own survival just to fund a blatant lie. My expression was completely flat and emotionless. "Oh, I am about to reorganize the whole family tree tonight, Mother," I replied, my voice low and completely devoid of any warmth. "I am going to make sure everyone gets exactly what they have earned." My mother smiled softly, completely missing the lethal double meaning hidden entirely behind my words. She patted my arm condescendingly and walked away to join the pastor near the window. The rest of the family continued to gloat, completely oblivious to the impending disaster. Terence walked over to the mahogany dining table and ran his hand along the polished wood, whistling softly to himself. "Nice setup you have here, Charmaine," he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "It is going to be a real shame if we have to leave early. I hope you have that little envelope ready for me like we discussed." I did not respond to his bait. I simply placed my glass of sparkling water on the marble counter and motioned for the private chef to begin the dinner service. "Everyone, please take your seats," I announced, my voice echoing perfectly through the large open space. "Dinner is served." The family eagerly rushed to the table, claiming their seats with loud, enthusiastic chatter. They were incredibly hungry for the lavish food, but they were even hungrier for the massive financial payout they believed was coming. My parents sat near the head of the table, beaming with completely unearned pride. Terence sat directly across from me, flanked by Keisha and Darnell. The pastor sat at the far end, ready to offer a hypocritical prayer. The waitstaff moved silently around the room, pouring expensive red wine and placing exquisite appetizers in front of each guest. The atmosphere was thick with overwhelming anticipation. They were all just waiting for the exact moment I would stand up, apologize for my terrible behavior, and hand over a check for $100,000 to save my precious corporate career. David stood near the head of the table, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking completely calm and utterly dangerous. He reached out and picked up a heavy silver spoon. He gently tapped the side of his crystal wine glass. The sharp ringing sound immediately cut through the loud chatter of my extended family. The room fell into an absolute dead silence. Every single pair of eyes locked onto David and then shifted slowly toward me. Terence leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms and offering a wide, triumphant smirk. He was fully prepared for his absolute victory. Keisha pulled out her smartphone, discreetly resting it on the table to likely record my impending, humiliating apology. My mother leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute satisfaction. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed my elegant black dress and took a deep breath. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the head of the long mahogany table, standing directly next to David. The entire family watched my every move, holding their collective breath. Terence extended his hand, palm facing upward, waiting for the thick paper check. But I was not holding a checkbook. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and picked up the incredibly thick, heavy red legal binder I had meticulously prepared in my office. I placed it firmly on the table with a loud, resounding thud that made several family members physically jump in their seats. I rested my hands flat on top of the red cover and looked directly into Terence's greedy, expectant eyes. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat loudly, preparing to deliver his customary theatrical blessing over the extravagant meal. He closed his eyes and raised his hands dramatically toward the vaulted ceiling. "Heavenly Father, we gather here tonight to give thanks for the immense blessings of family and the divine power of forgiveness." He began, his voice vibrating with spiritual authority. I did not bow my head. I did not close my eyes. I flipped the heavy red cover of the legal binder open, cutting off his prayer mid-sentence. "We are going to skip the grace tonight, Pastor," I announced, my voice slicing cleanly through the expectant silence of the room. "God already knows exactly what is in your hearts, and the truth requires my undivided attention." Reverend Thomas snapped his eyes open, his hands dropping to his sides in pure shock. A collective murmur of disapproval rippled down the mahogany table. My mother let out a sharp gasp. "Charmaine, you do not interrupt a man of God in this house," she hissed angrily. "I am not finished speaking." I replied coldly, picking up a stack of glossy color-printed packets that I had assembled from the master binder. I started at the head of the table, walking slowly down the left side, placing a heavy packet next to every crystal wine glass. I walked around the end of the table, distributing the identical packets until every single person had a stack of financial documents sitting on top of their linen napkins. "What is this garbage?" Terrence demanded, picking up the packet and flipping through the first few pages with a sneer of contempt. "Are these your corporate spreadsheets? We came here to get a check, Charmaine." I stopped back at the head of the table, standing tall beside David. "Oh, you are getting a check tonight, Terrence," I said softly. "Actually, you are getting a comprehensive review of exactly who writes all the checks in this family. Please, everyone, open your packets to page 1. The extended family looked incredibly confused. My Aunt Sarah adjusted her reading glasses and cautiously opened the cover page. My father frowned, staring at the numbers highlighted in bright neon yellow ink. Terrence let out an exasperated sigh, but Keisha immediately leaned over to look at his packet, her eyes darting nervously across the glossy pages. I watched the initials' confusion slowly curdle into dawning horror as the family realized they were not looking at a business proposal or an apology letter. They were holding my personal bank statements. They were looking at certified, unredacted wire transfer receipts, displaying the unvarnished reality of our financial dynamic. Earlier this week, Auntie Brenda posted a very passionate video claiming that I was a bougie, whitewashed sellout who had completely abandoned her family. I projected my voice clearly, ensuring every single syllable hit the far corners of the dining room. Several aunts shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding my gaze entirely. She claimed that my incredible brother Terrence was the true provider of this family, while I hoarded my corporate salary out of pure spite and jealousy. I want you all to look at page 2 of the packet in front of you. Go ahead, turn the page. The sound of rustling paper filled the quiet penthouse. I waited a beat, letting their eyes find the massive bolded numbers at the bottom of the sheet. On page 2, you will clearly see a certified bank receipt for a $450,000 wire transfer. I continued, my voice rising with absolute undeniable authority. That transfer was executed in October of 2022. It was wired directly from my personal savings account to a major national mortgage lender. That was the exact day I fully paid off the remaining balance of my parents' Connecticut home. I bought their financial freedom so they could comfortably retire. A sharp gasp echoed around the room. Aunt Sarah dropped her packet, the paper clattering against the china. Auntie Brenda, the loudest voice of the smear campaign, picked up her packet with trembling hands. She had boldly proclaimed to her congregation that I was a greedy elitist. Now she was staring at physical proof that I was the only root keeping the family tree alive. Uncle Marcus leaned over, reading the amounts, shaking his head in total disbelief. The silence of these vocal critics was the most delicious sound I had ever heard. They wanted receipts and I delivered them. My father turned incredibly pale, his mouth opening and closing silently. My mother stared down at the table, completely unable to look anyone in the eye. The illusion they had meticulously crafted over the last several years was instantly vaporized by cold, hard, irrefutable math. "But please do not stop there," I instructed, moving my finger down the imaginary list in the air. "Turn to page 4. Let us talk about the daily reality of my supposed selfishness. On page 4, you will see a recurring automatic monthly withdrawal of exactly $1,200. That money goes directly into a joint checking account accessed exclusively by Richard and Elaine. I pay for their groceries, I pay their utility bills, I fund the gas in their cars. I have been paying that exact amount every single month for the last 5 years without missing a single payment." I turned my gaze entirely onto my brother. Terrence was staring at the paper, his face turning a deep mottled shade of crimson. The smug, arrogant smirk had been completely wiped from his features, replaced by a mask of raw, humiliating exposure. "And what exactly is Terrence's financial contribution to this family?" I asked the question, hanging heavy in the air. I looked directly at my parents, who were visibly shrinking under the crushing weight of the public truth. "How much does the man of the house contribute, Mom? Does he buy your groceries?" Did he pay for the roof over your head? The answer is absolutely zero. My brother is a 35-year-old unemployed fraud who has never contributed a single dime to anyone sitting at this table. Reverend Thomas, the man who had confidently called me just 2 days ago to demand I apologize for my arrogant soul, suddenly looked violently ill. He stared down at the printed receipts, completely realizing he had aggressively backed the wrong horse in this massive family feud. The church gossips who had texted me vile insults just 48 hours ago were entirely dead silent. The truth was ugly, and it was staring them right in the face in high-definition color. "You manipulated this family, Terrence," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You let them believe you were a success while you secretly lived off the money I was bleeding out to keep our parents afloat. And when they finally ran out of cash, you tried to extort my fiancé for $40,000 under the guise of an entrance fee. You are not a provider. You are a parasite stealing from the very people you claim to protect," Terrence snapped. The complete public destruction of his fragile ego was too much to process. He violently slammed his fist down onto the mahogany table, rattling the crystal glasses and causing the silverware to clatter against the plates. "Shut up," he screamed, launching himself out of his chair like a cornered animal. He pointed a shaking, angry finger at my face, his chest heaving with explosive, unhinged rage. "You think this proves anything? You think printing out some fancy bank statements makes you the boss? You think your corporate money makes you a better person than me?" The two security guards standing discreetly near the kitchen immediately stepped forward, their hands ready, but David casually raised a hand to stop them. He knew I had this entirely under control. I did not back away from Terrence's aggressive posture. I stepped closer, leaning forward across the polished table, until I was looking directly into his wide, panicked, bloodshot eyes. I let a slow, icy smirk spread across my face, a completely genuine smile born of total, absolute victory. "No, Terrence," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and laced with lethal amusement. "I do not think my money makes me a better person than you, but it did buy me enough time to hire a very expensive private investigator to look deeply into your wife." The air in the room was sucked out. Keisha, who had been sitting rigidly in her chair pretending to be outraged on Terrence's behalf, suddenly froze completely solid. Her eyes went wide with raw, unfiltered terror. Her hand trembled violently, and the heavy silver fork she had been nervously holding slipped right from her fingers. It clattered loudly against the china plate, echoing like a gunshot in the dead silence of the room. She stared at me. Darnell shifted his arrogant posture, breaking into a nervous twitch. I slowly reached deep into my tailored pocket and smoothly pulled out a small, sleek black remote control. I did not break eye contact with Keisha as my thumb found the top button and pressed it firmly. A very low mechanical hum filled the quiet dining room. Behind me, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows were suddenly obscured as a heavy, white, motorized projector screen smoothly descended from a concealed compartment in the ceiling. The ambient lighting in the penthouse automatically dimmed. Another click of the remote, and a high-definition projector mounted above the dining table flared to life, casting a bright rectangular glow across the white canvas. The very first slide appeared in stark black and white. It was a massive blown-up image of the public registration documents for Apex Holdings, LLC. I used a laser pointer to highlight the principal managing director listed at the bottom of the form. The red dot danced directly over Darnell Washington's printed name and digital signature. A collective gasp echoed from my aunts. Uncle Marcus leaned so far forward, he nearly knocked over his wine glass. "Let us talk about generational wealth," I began, my voice echoing in the darkened room. "You claimed you were building an empire, Terrence. You stood in that gaudy foyer and demanded David pay you $40,000 to finalize your closing costs. But real estate requires actual capital, and you possess absolutely none." I pressed the remote again. The slide transitioned to a side-by-side comparison of Terrence's supposed property deed and a standard commercial lease agreement. "So Keisha found a brilliant workaround. She introduced you to a shadow lender. She fed your massive ego and told you that you were a genius investor who just needed a tiny bit of leverage to secure a luxury estate. I walked slowly around the table, standing directly behind Terrence's chair. He was gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He stared up at the screen, his mouth slightly open, trying desperately to comprehend the complex legal jargon that was actively destroying his life. "But you did not buy a house, Terrence," I whispered, leaning down so my voice carried right next to his ear. "You signed a severely inflated commercial lease. Your name is not on the deed to that mansion. You are nothing but a temporary tenant paying $12,000 a month to a shell company. And do you know who owns that shell company?" I pointed the laser back at the screen, circling Darnell's name. "Keisha's brother owns the house," I stated clearly, letting the devastating truth hang heavily in the air. "You sold out your own parents to play pretend on Instagram, Terrence. You wanted to look like a millionaire so badly that you let your own wife and her brother use you as a dumb pawn to execute a massive financial scam against our family. And they used mom and dad's equity to fund it." Terrence snapped his head around to look at Keisha. His eyes were wide with a mixture of raw betrayal and desperate confusion. "Keisha, tell her she is lying," he demanded, his voice cracking under the intense pressure. "Tell them this is just another one of her corporate tricks." Keisha did not look at him. She was staring at her empty plate, her chest heaving as she struggled to formulate a believable lie. Her complete silence in that devastating moment was the most absolute and damning public confession possible for her to make. The sheer perfection of the moment was incredibly intoxicating. I had spent years analyzing risk-mitigating corporate disasters and building structural safeguards for billionaires. I knew how to completely dismantle a hostile entity. My family had simply assumed my intelligence was confined exclusively to the corporate sphere. They vastly underestimated my ability to apply those exact same ruthless analytical skills to my personal life. They built their entire foundation on a fragile web of deceit, expecting me to quietly absorb the financial impact as I always had. But I was not a shock absorber anymore. I was the wrecking ball. But the scam does not stop with a fake lease. I continued marching back toward the front of the room. I clicked the remote and the screen flashed with a new document. It was the home equity line of credit, the $500,000 loan secured against my parents' house. My father, Richard, physically recoiled in his chair as he recognized his own signature at the bottom of the scanned page. My mother let out a small, terrified whimper, pressing her hands against her mouth. "Darnell did not just rent you a house, Terrence," I explained, projecting my voice so the entire family could hear the exact mechanics of their ruin. "He acted as the predatory lender. He required a massive balloon payment to keep the loan from going into immediate default. You needed cash fast. So you went crying to mom and dad. You told them it was a once-in-a-lifetime investment. And they were so eager to finally see their golden son succeed that they completely bypassed all logic and common sense. They signed away the entire equity of their fully paid home. They handed $500,000 of my hard-earned money directly to a con artist. The reality of the situation finally crashed down upon the room like a collapsing building. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal was paralyzing. Terrence was not a provider. He was an incredibly gullible victim who had willingly dragged his own parents into a financial slaughterhouse just to maintain a fake image on social media. And Keisha, the woman sitting right next to him, was the primary architect of the entire devastating operation. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen filled with a series of text messages. I had subpoenaed these records through a private investigator who specializes in digital forensics. The messages were between Keisha and Darnell, sent over the last 3 months. I read the most damning one aloud. "Just keep inflating his ego, Darnell. Terrence is so stupid he will sign anything if you tell him it makes him look rich. Once the parents' equity clears, we drain the account and I file for divorce." The dining room erupted into absolute chaotic panic. My mother shrieked a sound of pure, unadulterated agony as she fully realized she had mortgaged her entire life for absolutely nothing. She grabbed my father's arm, shaking him violently as tears streamed down her face. "Richard, what did we do?" she sobbed hysterically. "Oh my God, Richard, we are going to lose the house. We have nothing left." My father sat completely frozen, his eyes locked onto the screen, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The arrogant patriarch who had threatened to disown me just days ago was now reduced to a trembling, broken shell of a man. Aunt Sarah began shouting at Keisha, calling her a demon and a thief. Reverend Thomas clutched his chest, looking as though he might actually suffer a cardiac event right there at the dinner table. The people who had so eagerly judged me and attacked my character were now watching their own golden family implode in spectacular fashion. "It is a lie," Keisha screamed, finally finding her voice. She stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed onto the hardwood floor. She pointed a manicured finger at me, her face twisted into an ugly mask of sheer desperation. "She hacked my phone. She fabricated those messages. This is illegal. You cannot do this to me, Charmaine. I am going to sue you for everything you are worth." "You can certainly try, Keisha," I replied, my tone completely devoid of any emotion. "But you might want to save your legal fees for your upcoming criminal defense. Because wire fraud and elder abuse carry mandatory minimum sentences in federal prison." At the mention of federal prison, Darnell finally made his move. The smooth, arrogant broker realized the trap had fully closed, and he was looking at years behind bars. He did not say a word to his sister. He did not try to defend his actions. He simply stood up, adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit, and turned abruptly toward the grand double doors of the penthouse foyer. He was going to abandon Keisha and attempt to flee before the authorities could be notified. He took exactly 3 steps before a solid wall of muscle and bespoke charcoal wool blocked his path. David had moved with incredible speed and total silent precision. He stood directly in front of the heavy oak doors, his broad shoulders effectively sealing the only exit. His posture was completely relaxed, but his eyes were cold, calculating, and deeply dangerous. The 2 private security guards immediately stepped up, flanking David and cracking their knuckles in unison. "Excuse me," Darnell said, trying to maintain his facade of professional authority. His voice shook slightly, betraying his rising panic. "You are actively holding me against my will. Move out of the way right now, or I am calling the police and pressing charges for unlawful imprisonment." David did not move a single inch. He slowly reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek silver pen. He twirled it casually between his long fingers, observing Darnell the way a scientist might observe a highly stressed laboratory rat. "You can't leave, Darnell," David said smoothly. "We haven't discussed the default clause." Darnell stopped dead in his tracks, staring at David. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to project an aura of authority that was rapidly crumbling under the intense weight of David's cold stare. "What default clause?" Darnell asked, his voice cracking slightly. "I hold the note on that property. I am the primary lender. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here." David smiled. It was a terrifying smile, devoid of any warmth. He slowly stepped away from the heavy oak doors and walked back toward the mahogany dining table. He moved with the smooth, confident grace of an apex predator circling its trapped prey. "You are a terrible broker, Darnell." David began, his voice echoing loudly across the dead silence of the dining room. "Your shadow lending company was incredibly greedy. You wanted to execute this scam quickly. To fund the $500,000 line of credit for my future in-laws, you needed immediate liquid capital. So you bundled their massive debt into a high-risk commercial portfolio and you sold it on the secondary market." Darnell visibly swallowed hard, his arrogant posture completely deflating. "You sold that debt obligation 48 hours ago, hoping to secure your massive payday before anyone caught on to the fraudulent lease agreement." David continued, leaning heavily against the back of his chair. "But you were incredibly sloppy. You did not properly vet the institutional buyer on the other end of that transaction. You just saw the cash and immediately signed the transfer documents." Darnell took a shaky step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward Keisha, who was now openly weeping into her hands. The entire extended family watched this exchange in completely terrified silence. "Who bought the debt?" Darnell asked, his voice reduced to a harsh, terrified whisper. David straightened his suit jacket, his expression hardening into absolute stone. "My family's private equity firm bought the entire debt portfolio." He announced, the words dropping like heavy anvils onto the polished floor. The collective gasp from my family was deafening. My father Richard gripped the edge of the dining table, his knuckles completely white, staring at my fiancée with absolute horror. "You wanted me to pay $40,000 to enter this family, Richard," David asked, turning his piercing gaze directly onto my trembling father. "You demanded that I wire a massive check to cover your son's fraudulent closing costs. Instead, I paid $500,000 in cash to completely own your debt." The absolute brilliance of David's strategic maneuver finally registered in my parents' minds. They had tried to extort an architect, completely forgetting that he was also the heir to a massive institutional wealth fund. "Darnell is no longer the primary lender." David continued, his voice slicing cleanly through the panicked air. "I am. My firm holds the absolute legal right to the $500,000 lien currently attached to your property. And because Darnell structured the loan with incredibly predatory terms designed to force an immediate default, Terrence's failure to make that first $40,000 balloon payment triggered the acceleration clause this morning." David picked up his crystal wine glass, swirling the expensive red liquid thoughtfully before taking a slow, deliberate sip. "Darnell's LLC is officially in catastrophic default," David stated, placing the glass back onto the table. "We have already initiated the legal proceedings. My firm is foreclosing on Terrence's fake mansion tomorrow morning. And because you signed as the shadow guarantors, Richard, we are actively seizing your Connecticut home as direct collateral." My mother Elaine let out a completely unhinged wail of pure agony. She slumped forward, resting her head on the mahogany table, her shoulders shaking violently with uncontrollable sobs. My father buried his face in his hands, completely broken by the sheer magnitude of his massive failure. They had sacrificed their daughter to elevate their son, and in doing so, they had completely destroyed their own lives. Terrence sat frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the empty plate in front of him. The golden sun was entirely bankrupt. His fake mansion, his expensive clothes, his carefully curated social media image, all of it was instantly vaporized by cold, hard corporate reality. Keisha stopped crying and suddenly lunged across the table toward me, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You planned this!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You set us up, Charmaine. You purposely let us walk right into this trap." I did not flinch. I did not move a single inch. I simply stared back at her, completely unfazed by her pathetic outburst. "I did not force you to orchestrate a massive financial scam, Keisha," I replied, my voice perfectly calm and even. "I did not force my parents to leverage their entire retirement to feed Terrence's massive ego. You all built this trap with your own greed. I just locked the door from the outside." Darnell ran a shaking hand over his face, his professional facade completely shattered. He realized the absolute catastrophe he had engineered. He had not just scammed a naive older couple out of their retirement savings. He had accidentally committed massive federal wire fraud directly against a billion-dollar private equity firm. The legal consequences were no longer civil. They were highly criminal. "Look, man," Darnell stammered, turning toward David with a desperate, pleading expression. "Let us just work this out. I can dissolve the LLC. I can reverse the transfer. We can completely tear up the original paperwork right now and pretend none of this ever happened. Just give me 24 hours to secure the funds." David laughed. It was a short, harsh sound that conveyed absolutely zero mercy. "The paperwork was legally filed with the Federal Registry this morning, Darnell. You cannot reverse a completed corporate acquisition. You committed felony fraud across state lines. You used electronic communications to facilitate an illegal extraction of equity. That is wire fraud. My corporate lawyers have already handed the entire unredacted file, including all of Keisha's text messages, directly to the federal authorities." The word federal hung heavily in the air, completely suffocating any remaining hope Darnell or Keisha had of escaping this disaster. The church gossips, the aunts who had sent me vile messages, the pastor who had demanded I apologize. All of them sat in stunned, terrified silence. They were actively witnessing the total annihilation of the Golden family they had so fiercely protected. The black tax, the relentless expectation that I would endlessly fund their toxic behavior, was officially canceled. I had not just cut them off, I had completely bankrupted their entire fraudulent reality. My father slowly raised his head from his hands, his eyes completely red and filled with desperate pleading tears. Charmaine, he rasped, his voice completely broken. Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell David to cancel the foreclosure. We are your parents. You cannot let us lose our home. We have absolutely nowhere else to go. I looked at the man who had gladly handed $500,000 of my money to a con artist. I looked at the man who had proudly defended my brother while abandoning me in an empty ballroom. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no obligation. Humbled yet, I asked softly, echoing the exact toxic phrase my mother had used just an hour ago. My father opened his mouth to speak, but before he could form another pathetic excuse, a sudden loud noise echoed through the penthouse. It was a heavy, authoritative knocking coming directly from the grand double doors of the foyer. The sound was sharp, demanding, and completely undeniable. Boom, boom, boom. The entire family jumped in their seats, terrified by the sudden intrusion. David looked at me, offering a slight approving nod. Right on time, he murmured, adjusting his cuffs. Darnell backed away from the doors, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He knew exactly who was standing on the other side of that heavy oak wood. Keisha covered her mouth, whimpering softly as the reality of her impending arrest finally crushed her arrogant spirit. Terrence just sat there completely numb, waiting for the inevitable consequences of his massive failure. I stood tall at the head of the table, surrounded by the absolute ruins of my toxic bloodline. The heavy knocking echoed again, louder this time, accompanied by a deep, commanding voice demanding immediate entry. "Open the door, David," I instructed, my voice completely steady and authoritative. "Let the guests in." The final act of this massive family drama was about to begin. David turned away from Darnell without a single ounce of hesitation. He walked smoothly toward the grand oak double doors of the penthouse. The heavy knocking had not ceased. It was rhythmic and authoritative, shaking the heavy brass fixtures. David reached out, turning the deadbolt and pulling the massive doors wide open. The hallway was completely flooded with law enforcement personnel. Two federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the letters FBI emblazoned across the back in stark yellow font stepped into the grand foyer. Behind them, four local uniformed police officers stood with their hands resting defensively on their utility belts. Their expressions were completely stern and uncompromising. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with graying temples, walked directly into the center of the living room, completely ignoring the lavish Thanksgiving spread on the mahogany table. He surveyed the terrified faces of my extended family before pulling a folded white document from his jacket pocket. "This is a federal warrant," he announced, his deep voice commanding absolute authority in the dead silent room. "I am looking for Darnell Washington and Keisha Washington." The name dropped into the room like a live grenade. The ants who had been so incredibly vocal on social media physically shrank back into their expensive dining chairs, desperately trying to make themselves entirely invisible. Reverend Thomas clutched his leather Bible to his chest, his eyes wide with absolute horror, as the reality of the situation finally penetrated his self-righteous facade. Darnell tried to back away, but there was nowhere left for him to run. The heavy glass windows of the penthouse offered a beautiful view of the Manhattan skyline, but absolutely no actual escape route. The lead federal agent locked eyes with the arrogant broker and walked straight toward him. "Darnell Washington, you are officially under arrest," the agent stated, pulling a heavy pair of steel handcuffs from his dark belt. "The charges include multiple counts of federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, and severe elder abuse. Put your hands behind your back immediately." Darnell raised his trembling hands, surrendering completely to the inevitable reality. He did not put up a fight. He knew the absolute scale of his massive financial crimes, and he knew David possessed the exact paper trail required to put him in a federal penitentiary for a very long time. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut around his expensive tailored wrists echoed loudly in the dining room. It was the absolute sweetest sound I had ever heard. The man who had confidently planned to strip my parents of their only asset and walk away incredibly rich was now completely stripped of his freedom. Two uniformed officers immediately flanked Darnell, grabbing his arms roughly and turning him toward the front doors. He kept his head completely down, staring at the floor. But the federal agents were not finished. The lead agent turned his piercing gaze toward the opposite side of the table. Keisha was shaking so violently her chair rattled against the hardwood floor. She looked like a cornered rat trapped entirely by her own massive greed and arrogance. Keisha Washington, the agent, continued, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy whatsoever. You are also under arrest for federal wire fraud conspiracy and attempted extortion. Stand up and place your hands behind your back right now. Keisha completely lost her mind. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that shattered the remaining quiet of the luxury penthouse. No! She shrieked, thrashing wildly as two large police officers moved quickly toward her. You cannot do this to me. I did not do anything wrong. It was all Darnell. He made me do it. She was actively throwing her own brother under the bus, trying desperately to save her own skin, but the federal agents did not care. They grabbed her arms, ignoring her violent physical thrashing, and forced her hands firmly behind her back. The second pair of handcuffs clicked shut. You set me up! Charmaine, Keisha screamed, spitting pure venom across the table as the officers physically restrained her against the chair. You planned this whole thing just to ruin my life. You are an absolute monster. I did not even blink. I just watched her completely unravel before my eyes. You ruined your own life, Keisha, I replied, my tone clinical and completely detached. I simply provided the audience for your absolute destruction. Look at your husband. I pointed directly at Terrence, who was sitting just inches away from her. The golden sun was completely broken. He had not moved to defend his wife. He had not stood up to challenge the federal agents. He was slumped heavily forward in his dining chair, his face buried deep in his hands, weeping like an incredibly small, terrified child. The massive ego that had fueled his entire fraudulent existence was completely pulverized. He was bankrupt, homeless, and his wife was currently being dragged away in steel handcuffs. He had absolutely nothing left to his name. The loudmouth aunts who had confidently texted me vile insults just yesterday were now staring at the floor, completely dead silent. Aunt Sarah covered her face with her expensive linen napkin, hiding her extreme shame. They had actively rallied behind a criminal and maliciously attacked the only person who had ever financially supported them. Now they were forced to sit there and actively witness the brutal, horrifying consequences of their blind, toxic loyalty. They would never be able to show their arrogant faces in their local church congregation again. Suddenly, the sound of a heavy wooden chair scraping violently across the polished floor broke my intense observation. My mother, Elaine, pushed herself up from the dining table, her face heavily stained with dark mascara tears and absolute unadulterated desperation. She stumbled forward, her weak legs completely giving out beneath her as she approached me. She fell hard onto her knees right beside where I was standing tall. Her hands reached out, grabbing the luxurious black fabric of my silk designer dress. She gripped it so incredibly tightly, her knuckles turned entirely white under the dining room lights. Charmaine, please, she wailed, her voice cracking under the crushing, oppressive weight of her complete financial ruin. Stop this. Tell David to call off the bank. Tell the federal police to let them go right now. We can fix this massive mistake. Just give us the house back. We are your parents, Charmaine. You cannot let us sleep out on the street. We are blood. We are your family. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman kneeling on the hardwood floor of my fiancé's luxury penthouse. This was the exact same woman who had smirked at me during brunch, telling me I was incredibly lucky they even included me out of sheer pity. This was the selfish woman who had watched me stand alone in an empty $15,000 ballroom and actively chose to party at a fake rented mansion instead. My face remained entirely devoid of any emotion. I did not feel any sudden surge of daughterly affection. I did not feel the heavy oppressive guilt of the black tax dragging me down anymore. I felt completely free from their toxic chains. I reached down and slowly peeled her trembling fingers off my dress one by one. Blood is what keeps you alive, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute whisper that carried perfectly across the quiet, dead room. You guys were bleeding me dry. The bank owns the house now. My mother let out a devastated, broken sob, collapsing completely against the cold hardwood floor. My father, Richard, did not move from his chair at all. He just stared blankly at the far wall, a completely hollow, empty shell of the proud, arrogant man who had demanded a $40,000 entrance fee just a few days ago. The federal agents had definitely seen enough of this dramatic family spectacle. "Let us move out," the lead agent commanded sharply, signaling his uniformed officers. They forcefully dragged Keisha out of the dining room. She kicked and screamed the entire way, her hysterical, unhinged shrieks echoing loudly down the elegant hallway and completely fading away as the heavy oak double doors slammed firmly shut behind them. Darnell walked out silently, his head bowed in total, absolute defeat. The penthouse suddenly felt empty, despite the crowd of relatives sitting around the mahogany table. The luxurious Thanksgiving dinner sat untouched, growing cold on the expensive china plates. The massive display of wealth they hungered for turned into a literal crime scene. I slowly turned my attention back to the extended family. They stared at me with absolute fear and terrifying respect. The corporate sellout had dismantled their entire social hierarchy in exactly 30 minutes. "The dinner party is officially over," I announced, my voice ringing with total finality. "I want everyone to leave my home immediately." The family was utterly destroyed. 6 months later, the freezing autumn winds of Manhattan have been entirely replaced by the bright, warm, golden sun of the stunning Amalfi Coast. I am currently standing on a breathtaking cliffside terrace overlooking the incredibly sparkling blue waters of the beautiful Tyrrhenian Sea in gorgeous Italy. The gentle, salty ocean breeze perfectly catches the delicate white lace train of my stunning custom designer wedding dress. I take a very deep breath, slowly closing my eyes and completely letting the incredible healing warmth of the bright Mediterranean sun wash over my face. There is no dark anxiety gnawing my stomach today. There is no heavy, oppressive guilt lingering in the back of my mind. There are no frantic, demanding text messages requesting emergency wire transfers, and absolutely no manipulative emotional guilt trips waiting for me on my cell phone. When I finally turn around to look at the outdoor reception area, I do not see a single empty chair. The intimate space is perfectly set for exactly 50 guests, and every single luxurious seat is filled with people who genuinely want to celebrate my ultimate happiness. David's incredibly supportive family is sitting there laughing loudly together and joyfully raising their crystal glasses in a beautiful toast. My carefully chosen family tightly surrounds them all. My closest lifelong friends, my loyal professional mentors, and the incredible corporate colleagues who stood fiercely by my side during the darkest days of my entire life are all present today. There is absolutely no one from my toxic biological bloodline in attendance at this wedding. No Aunt Sarah, no Reverend Thomas, no Terrence, no Richard, and definitely no Elaine. The complete physical absence of my biological family is not a painful emotional void. It is a profound and intensely beautiful spiritual liberation. The absolute and total destruction of their massive, fraudulent empire was incredibly swift and utterly merciless. The criminal justice system did not care about their fake social media image, and the strict federal courts certainly did not care about the emotional black tax. The rapid-fire legal closure of my miserable past life was highly documented in the permanent public record for anyone who ever cared to look. Keisha is currently wearing a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit, successfully serving a mandatory 5-year minimum sentence in a high-security federal prison for aggravated wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. Her desperately fake tears and her constant pathetic blame shifting did not save her from the absolute crushing reality of her own massive blinding greed. Darnell foolishly tried to secure a lenient plea deal, but the extensive paper trail I personally handed over to the authorities was completely bulletproof. The federal government immediately seized every single one of his fake shell companies, froze his hidden offshore bank accounts, and forcefully liquidated his entire real estate portfolio. He rapidly went from being a smug luxury real estate broker to an entirely bankrupt federal inmate in just a matter of a few extremely short weeks. My supposedly flawless golden brother Terrence experienced the most unimaginably brutal personal reality check ever created. Without his gigantic fake rented mansion, without Keisha's endless manipulative criminal schemes, and without my personal bank account constantly funding his entire lazy existence, he completely collapsed. He is currently fully homeless, sleeping terribly on a badly stained, sagging couch in the severely cramped living room of a very distant friend who is already growing incredibly tired of his constant, endless complaining. His massive, fragile, arrogant ego was entirely stripped away forever, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a totally empty 35-year-old man who finally has to face his own profound, crushing daily uselessness alone. And then there are my parents. Richard and Elaine permanently lost the beautiful, large Connecticut colonial house that I had worked so incredibly hard for 5 long years to pay off completely. David's powerful firm executed the commercial foreclosure with absolute flawless legal precision, and the sprawling property was quickly sold at a loud public commercial auction. My parents were forcefully evicted by the local county sheriff, and they reluctantly had to move all their remaining cheap belongings into a tiny, horribly cramped one-bedroom apartment located on the absolute worst outskirts of our old hometown. Their once pristine, perfect reputation in the massive local church was permanently and totally ruined forever. The very same judgmental congregation that had so eagerly and viciously attacked me completely turned their backs on my parents the exact moment the severe federal criminal indictments became public knowledge. My mother no longer proudly brags loudly about her wonderful golden son, miraculously keeping the family together. She now lives her remaining years in total crushing, isolating, humiliating silence. I slowly walk right up to the very edge of the incredibly magnificent solid stone terrace, looking directly into the glass lens of the digital camera, currently documenting my own beautifully restored, peaceful life. I am actively choosing to boldly and proudly share this one vital final reflection with every single one of you bravely watching me right now today, because I absolutely know some wonderful person out there desperately needs to finally hear the absolute, beautiful, liberating truth about these entirely toxic, forced family expectations. They tell Black women that our strength lies in how much abuse we can endure for the sake of the family. They call it loyalty, I call it a generational curse. Forgiving them would not have made me a bigger person, it just would have made me a better victim. I lost my parents and my brother on the night of my engagement, but the next morning I found myself. If you are carrying the weight of people who only love what you can do for them, put it down. The only thing waiting on the other side of that boundary is peace. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family to save yourself? Drop your receipts in the comments. Hit subscribe and never apologize for protecting your peace.